Hi everybody, this is Mike from BuzzTox, and I'm here to pick apart all of the current trailer footage from HBO's Watchmen and give you a breakdown about what we feel is going to happen in the show. So for the TV show, we have to imagine what's going to happen in that world over the next 30 years. The events of 1985 causing new threats and new social changes in the world. We can see that Rorschach's journal was published, but it was rejected by the media. It was seen as fake news of sorts, and it's given rise to this Rorschach cult who call themselves the 7th Cavalry, which are notable in American history. They were at Little Bighorn, and this was Custer's last stand, where they were overwhelmed by the outnumbering native forces, and a lot of them died there. So the 7th Cavalry see themselves as these true American heroes of sorts. We know they've read the journal and that it's been published because they quote it in a recorded message saying something that Rorschach once said, "They will shout, 'Save us,' and we will whisper, 'No.'" So this violent, far right-wing terrorist group who have twisted Rorschach's history, they see him as a martyr. They see the refusal to believe Rorschach as a left-wing conspiracy. And it's interesting in this darker reflection of our current political, social climate. We see it as a reflection of now, much like The Watchmen was a darker image of the Cold War era, the comic was. We see them wielding shotguns, breaking down doors, building bombs and suicide vests, and at some point, the cavalry attacked members of the police in Tulsa, Oklahoma, en masse and in their homes. So the question is, why do this? If you're a cult at this time, why go for the police of all people? If you know the comics, then you'll know that it's revenge for Rorschach. What happens in the comics, the last two things that Rorschach does publicly is attack police. Once by accident, when he was breaking into another adventurer's house, the comedian, to see why the comedian got killed. There was a cop there, and he hit him to get away, so they see him as violence against police is okay. And then the second time, the police, they find Rorschach, they demask him, and they put him in jail. So they've got something against the police in general because of their treatment of Rorschach and how they saw that Rorschach was indifferent to how you treat them. After this first attack by the cavalry on the police we now see are wearing masks and have secret identities to protect themselves and their families from this type of incident ever happening again. And it appears that there's two tiers of police, likely on some sort of ranking system. You've got these yellow-masked, uniformed officers, and these individual-made masks and costumes, maybe for the higher-ranking individuals. There's a dog handler with a Anubis dog head mask. There's a guy in a panda mask. There's a detective in a red jumpsuit who's known as Red Scare, not in the comics, and we have our main protagonist, who's also not in the comics either, and her name is going to be Angela Abar, and her costume name is going to be Sister Night, played by Regina King. And it shows that she was a victim of the cavalry assault, and we're not sure if this is the first assault which happened, or whether this is the second assault which happens by the cavalry against the police. But in the scene, we see her ducking for cover, protecting her family, and fighting off cavalry forces that go into her house during Christmas time. So this could be a flashback scene from a long time ago, which forms her kind of revenge narrative that she's on, or justice narrative that she's all about. Or this could be a second attack which happens during the main timeline of the show. So as Sister Night, she's wearing makeup, a hood, and Catholic iconography. We see her suit up, and she opens a drawer, and it's filled with a rosary and a crucifix and ice picks and batons and flashlights. And like Rorschach, her pain causes her to see the world in duality of black and white, right and wrong. And we see her in a classroom, maybe as a part of her secret identity, hiding from the cavalry, giving a lesson to kids. And interesting, in this scene, she chooses to make the symbol for the Watchman and for the comedian, the smiley face, in eggs for the kids. And the teacher gives her a questionable look, like, "What are you doing the comedian's symbol? He wasn't such a good guy. Maybe she should know better." Her boss is Chief Judd Crawford of Tulsa Police, played by Don Johnson, and he's Don Johnson. He's a suave, lovable mentor figure and probably an all-around badass. He's in charge, but he isn't wearing a mask at all. He's shown as a mentor figure to Angela. They speak casually to one another, and he tells her that she's often been able to get him to cool down his temper in the past. So he protects her, I'm sure. There's a funeral scene, presumably after the second attack by the cavalry, and the chief says, we convinced ourselves that they were gone, but they were just hibernating. So it seems like the cavalry have returned, and the chief's response is to take in anyone who might be associated with them. And this is where we get Looking Glass, played by Tim Blake Nelson, who's brought in as an interrogator. So he's first introduced in the HBO trailer watching a documentary on mass criminals called American Hero Story, Minutemen. And this is that early group of Minutemen from the 30s. And we see ads for this documentary on Zeppelins. Yes, there are Zeppelins in this world flying around everywhere. And taxi cabs. And we can assume it will be revisited throughout the show to kind of flesh out the backstory of the Watchmen world. The scene is interesting with him sitting down because it shows Looking Glass watching television in a robe, which is exactly what one of the main characters from Watchmen the comic does at the beginning of the comic. And Looking Glass is also eating beans right out of the can, which is a direct thing that Rorschach does in the comic books. So these are two of the most morally complex and debatable characters in the Watchmen comic. They're essentially horrible people, anti-heroes. But while Rorschach is like Angela, seeing the world in right and wrong, black and white, the comedian held no moral code at all except patriotism. And I think this imagery kind of gives us a look at Looking Glass and compels him as a character. It makes him more compelling, and he's a character who could be swayed towards either direction. We don't know where he's going to go. In the documentary he's watching, we see a depiction of the first appearance of masked adventurers in this world. And that's Hooded Justice, the very first hero. Appeared in the 1930s, and he breaks through the window of a grocery store to stop it from being robbed. And the clerk asks, "Who are you?" And in corny dialogue, Justice replies, "Who am I? If I knew that, then I wouldn't be wearing a mask." This line is interesting because it causes Looking Glass, even though it's corny, it causes Looking Glass to pause and reflect about this line and about himself. And I believe this scene is meant to tell us that Looking Glass doesn't know who he is either. And perhaps he's conflicted between the current philosophies of this world and the things that's going on around him. And he's uneasy about his place in it all. We see him later walking through a warehouse where cavalry members or cavalry associates have been gathered and tied up by police for interrogation. Looking Glass, he wears this reflective mask, which has to be inspired by the Rorschach mask and what he's wearing in general. He's very Rorschach-like in his walk and build. And the mask forces the interviewees to reflect and confront their own guilt. He interrogates people in what police call the pod, which is this chamber which flashes a series of images, likely chosen by Looking Glass to unnerve the suspects that he's interviewing. In this case, in the trailer, we see imagery of Rorschach blot tests. We see a cowboy, army personnel, an atomic explosion. These are powerful images which might provoke emotional responses from cavalry members who see themselves as heroes fighting for a just cause. Going away from Looking Glass, another character comes in. We're introduced to Laurie Blake, played by Jean Smart. She's an FBI agent, and interestingly, a former hero herself known as Silk Spectre. She was a legacy hero, so her mother was the original Silk Spectre of the 1930s, one of the very first heroes, and she was kind of forced into being a hero and taking her place, even though she didn't really want to. Her father was the immoral Eddie Blake, the comedian who I was talking about, who was killed by Ozymandias at the beginning of the Watchmen comic. She's brought in to the show, likely to lead the investigation on the second cavalry attack. She was never really comfortable with being a mask in the comics, and in the trailers we see her critique masks, saying they're driven by trauma, obsessed with justice because of the injustices of their past. We also see her tease a supposed member of the 7th Cavalry who may be having his rights violated by police. We also see her shooting a masked villain in a bank robbery scene. She's essentially had enough of masks in general, in both villain and hero, and she's just there to stop what's going on and find out where these cavalry guys are. So these four characters, Angela, Chief Crawford, Laurie, and Looking Glass, are going to drive the plot of the show as they separately investigate the cavalry in their own way and uncover a larger conspiracy. Angela becomes involved with another cult, which has arisen after the events of 19 New York, and what I'm calling the Squid Cult. These are people dressed in white with Spock haircuts and pointed ears. They seem to be devotees of Dr. Manhattan, or perhaps they worship the squid or bring them together. They're going on the events of 1985. It was so traumatic that it inspired new religion from the significance of the event. And we see in this world that baby squid showers fall from the sky as a regular event, likely as an unintended result of the squid monster created by Veidt. And these might have religious significance to the people in the world now. The squid cult people, it's unclear whether they're good or bad, but they're in conflict with the cavalry, and one of them warns Angela that they must be stopped. We also see a figure in a robe and a wig, a judge of sorts for the squid cult maybe, and standing in front of a squid drawing. There's also a scene in which it looks as if Laurie is being held hostage, and there in the background is the squid eye image from the Watchmen comic, and it's got Dr. Manhattan's symbol around the edge of it, so they're combined in this cult in some sort of way. Angela finds herself out of costume going into this futuristic hallway, and in the same scene we see her put on futuristic looking goggles, and we can assume that she's found the workshop of Night Owl, this gadget-based second generation hero. And those are likely Night Owl's goggles that she puts on. And Night Owl's ship, Archie, is shown being piloted by Chief Crawford. Archie is also shown destroying this drone plane and then crash landing with the Chief inside of it. I think that the Chief is likely the one to die early in the show, which would support Angela's revenge narrative and show the viewer that this is HBO and the stakes are high and anyone can die. Looking Glass later on somehow ends up locating one of the cavalry headquarters shown in the terror footage, the church scene. We see another squid cult mural in the headquarters in the same church, and in that same scene it appears as if Dr. Manhattan has shown up again, and we see his powers used in this scene to drop something behind Looking Glass. And this could be so that he finds the dropped object itself because it's of significance, or maybe dropping the object is a distraction so that something else can happen, or that maybe he won't get shot. Something like that is occurring. So there might be this Dr. Manhattan in the background manipulating events as they occur. And we might see later that he's manipulated more than we think. So that might be a kind of an ongoing plot, is him interfering with things because he's got his own plans. And just to reiterate, there are no other beings with real power. So when you see a blue ball drop out of a portal in the air, it shouldn't be, in this world, a different character. It should just be Dr. Manhattan that's doing something quite like that, something supernatural like that. And let's get on to Dr. Manhattan 2 now in this world. It's been over 30 years. He's been living on Mars, and we see a scene of him in the trailer dissolving, puffing away his home in satellite imagery of the planet. And presumably we see him in that last scene walking up an empty street and picking up a mask with his own face on it, likely coming from some sort of weird squid cult celebration. And a little Easter egg for fans, he's wearing the same black suit that he liked wearing in the 1960s, and he became a fashion symbol about it. So, now you're all wondering, what about Veidt? What's happened with him? He was the main villain / hero of Watchmen, and what is he doing now? We've touched on his past and how he saved the world by killing millions. Now he's played by Jeremy Irons in the new show, and Veidt has a philosophy in the past that the ends justify the means, and he sees himself as the only one capable of making the hard decisions for humanity, as the smartest man in the world. So, In the trailer, we see him in a mansion, blowing out a solitary candle on a cake, looking solemn and bored. Part of him must feel like he failed in 1985. He saved the world from one apocalypse, but perhaps he sees another right around the corner. Or he sees the distorted world which has grown from his own interference. We see images of him riding alongside the countryside, past a skull and crossbones flag hanging from a scythe, which is a direct reference to the Black Freighter comic written within the Watchmen comic book. The Watchmen had a comic within a comic, and you read that comic along the way. And that story was a pirate story about a man who becomes worse and worse and evil, even though he has the best of intentions. And Alan Moore once said that the Black Freighter comic, that storyline, was a direct parallel to Veight's storyline within Watchmen. He loses sight of his own humanity and becomes that which he doesn't want to become at all, but he doesn't realize it. The trailer shows Veight meditating, and then he has this awesome Jeremy Irons smile to himself as if he's got the answer to a question. And he says ominous quotes like, "Nothing ever ends, it only's just begun," and "Masks make men cruel." So Veight has a new plan. We see him opening a chamber to a device, and we show him detonating a bomb in what looks like his own mansion. So at one point in the trailer, we see the Tulsa Sun newspaper ad, and on the title page, Veight officially declared dead. The text reads, "Industrialist and political kingmaker, costumed adventurer, was formally declared," and this is interesting, "presumed deceased," in that tiny little text there. So perhaps he blew up his own mansion to disappear as a part of his plan and is only presumed dead because they couldn't find the body. Or maybe he's just been gone for so long from the United States, from the world in general, that they are now declaring him dead. He's disappeared. It's also interesting that they call him a political kingmaker. We know that in this fictional world, Robert Redford, yes, Robert Redford, the actor, became a multi-termed president after Watchmen, after the events of the 1985 in Watchmen. And it seems that Adrian Veidt likely supported his rise to power and his administration. The newspaper also points to the ongoing danger of this world with headlines reading, "KKK vandalism forces Statue of Liberty closure," "Boise squid shower destroys homeless camp, kills 2. And squid showers are interesting and are likely the result of Veidt genetically meddling with the giant squid monster. But could it be that Veidt actually controls where those squid showers occur? He's the squid guy. He made the squid. He can do squid things. So that could be the case. There's also going to be flashback scenes. The ones showing old cars and things like that, showing explosions and mass violence. This is the Tulsa race riots of 1921. These really happened, and I think we're going to have flashbacks. It's no coincidence that they chose Tulsa as a backdrop for this story, because Tulsa, it's known as the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. And I believe that that's the scenes that we're seeing, where it's rioting, there's people running, and there's bombs going off. It's not 1930s, it's in the Minutemen times, it's 1920s. So we can expect the show to go deep into social and race issues, which will have you reflect on how much the Watchmen world is really different from our own. In general, Lindelof says that the show is going to examine how we feel as a society about heroes, specifically masked heroes. And I think that there's going to be 2 main things going on here. We're going to have the micro story in Tulsa with Laurie, with Angela, and with Looking Glass, in which they figure out what's going on with the Rorschach cult. But at the same time, we're going to have this macro story of the meddlers, I'm going to call them. That's Manhattan and Ozymandias. And they're interfering with the affairs of mankind once again. They think that they've got answers and they can solve problems. And the Tulsa events are going to lead Sister Knight, Angela, into what really happened in the 1980s. And it's eventually going to bring her into wanting to stop Veidt or Manhattan's new plans for humanity. And this revelation might come from Lou Gossett Jr., shown in the trailer, who warns her that there's a vast and hideous conspiracy at play. And that's all we've got for our trailer footage. Remember to give us any questions and comments below. And remember to like and subscribe us here at BuzzTox. Thanks a lot, everybody.